In 2021, India celebrated 75 years of independence from British rule. Disruptive times in the world's largest democracy. And a reason for us to talk to a renowned political scientist in Delhi today about political communication and the state of liberal societies. My name is Antonia Sankey, and I warmly welcome Professor Pratap Bhanu Mehta to this episode of GMF Talk.
Thank you. Wonderful to be here.
Mr. Mehta, between the increasing civil and political polarization in the global north and, on the other hand side, China's growing influence around the globe, it may seem as if democracies like India are losing out. What needs to be done in order to strengthen liberal societies?
I think you're right, Antonia. It is a moment of crisis for liberal democracy. And some of the established democracies in the world, the United States and India, are two major examples of democracies that are backsliding in terms of the quality of their democracy. I think the most important thing that needs to be done, I think, for a democracy is to, first of all, have faith in the democratic project. That if you look at the long arc of 20th century history, democracies in the long run, will deliver more prosperity and freedom to their peoples. And I think reinvigorating that ideological faith, I think, is the first and most important step. I think the second and most important step is, and particularly because we are talking on a television channel, there's something happening to our information order, our modes of communication, the way in which we construct our civil discourse, public sphere. They're increasingly polarized in all our countries. And I think the interesting question is there something about the structures of media ownership in our country, the forms of discourse that take place in social media, that is actually in some senses weakening democracy? So what are the forms of communication and what are the institutions behind it that would, invigorate democratic debate in a much more healthy direction?
You are a prominent critic of Narendra Modi's government, right? I mean, you've touched upon social media and the political situation generally in democracies today. How would you describe, just for our international viewers, the current Indian administration's political communication? How does that fit in there?
So look, I think the political communication has four elements. First of all, electoral democracy is still very strong in India. Elections matter a lot. And I think it's very important to this regime that it sees itself being legitimized through elections. But having said that, it has taken India down sort of three pathways that sort of, vitiate the nature of Indian democracy. First of all is its ethnic majoritarianism. What that means is basically it's a regime that says that India is primarily a country for Hindus, who are the dominant ethnic majority, and that minorities, particularly Muslims, will have to accept a subordinate cultural place, right? So that's the first sort of, I think, deviation from democracy. Second, it's also resorting increasingly to institutionally authoritarian measures. What does that mean? It means curtailing civil liberties in some instances. So journalists are, for example, arrested. Human rights activists are arrested. And the regime has tried to ensure that it can have as much control over the information order, particularly television media, as much as possible. So it's majoritarian, it's authoritarian. And I think increasingly India is also looking to be, looking like a much greater, much more unequal society in some ways. That the model of development that we are committed to is actually, while it's producing some growth, it is also producing greater inequality.
Do you have any knowledge on the role that fake news and also algorithms, so new technologies, play in this communication strategy?
Oh, actually, a very significant role. So, one of the things we've learned from the Facebook whistleblower, for example, right, is that there is systematic fake news in India, and it's a systematic operation, which is the ruling party, for example, has organized parties of trolls. It has an organized infrastructure to, in some senses, propagate and leverage news. Facebook did not have any infrastructure to monitor fake news or more damagingly hate speech in Indian languages, right? So it was basically a kind of free for all, which if you were more organized, you could leverage. In Indian elections, WhatsApp groups are becoming increasingly important. There's actually there are very few mechanisms to weed out hate speech in particular, which I think is much more important in India than fake news is. Where you, in some senses, send messages that stigmatize minorities or particular groups. There is relatively little ability to regulate that kind of speech. And the ruling party has been able to use that to its advantage, I think, much more than the liberal, left, or center parties have been able to do.
Recently, Mr. Mehta, you said that for the first time in decades, at this moment, you couldn't really say with confidence anymore that younger generations would lead a better life than those before them. Why did you lose your confidence in this notion of progress?
I think two reasons. One, if you look at India's growth trajectory from, let's say, about 2003 to 2010, India was doing about 8% growth rate a year. And there was a kind of confidence that, the Indian economic model was finally beginning to come into its own. Over the last 6 to 7 years, that growth rate has slipped. India is now doing average of 4 to 5% a year. It had two major shocks. It had a shock of demonetization, where Mr. Modi sort of withdrew all the currency notes from the economy, and then it had the COVID shock, right, for 2 years. And it's an open question whether India's growth trajectory will hit the 8% growth mark again. Second, if you look at inequality, so there's a new inequality report out by, Thomas Piketty and his associates, which specifically looks at India. And the top 10% in India control 50% of India's wealth. The bottom 50% have only 13% of all of India's wealth, right? So India's economy is growing. It's growing at 5 to 6%. The top 10, 15% are actually doing pretty well. The stock market is at an all-time high. Financial markets are booming. But I think if you look at particularly the bottom 50% of the population, right? I think it is fair to say that over the last 3 or 4 years, their economic prospects have dimmed. And in COVID in particular, for the first time, almost 100 million people fell back below the poverty line, right? Partly because of the COVID lockdowns, partly because of lack of jobs. India's labor participation rate, right? The number of people participating in employment has fallen from 44% roughly, 6 or 7 years ago to about 37.5% now, right? So clearly there is a crisis in terms of employment. And I think that's the main reason for thinking that the economic prospects don't look as bright as, we assumed a few years ago.
But what would need to happen to brighten your outlook again? Maybe if you could give a short answer on that one.
So two things. One, I think the invigoration of democracy itself, which is that, the ruling party, the BJP, currently dominates Indian politics. And frankly, the opposition is, relatively weak because political competition itself will produce a certain form of accountability on government. And I think the second thing is, in a sense, I think, concentrating on one question as being fundamental to the future of India, which is how does India generate inclusive growth? I think Indian politics is distracted by too many, destructive questions, ethnic division, for example. And I think a commitment across all political parties that unless India generates inclusive growth, the future of most of our citizens is not going to look as bright.
To understand and to react to the challenges societies face, we need to look at the way that politics work and their ways of communication. So thank you, Mr. Mehta. Thank you for those valuable insights into the Indian media landscape and into the political situation and communication.
Thank you very much.